Hello everyone and welcome back to another Strategoi video. It's just Jonas today and we're doing a very interesting video on the Krondspine incarnate of Ghur. You guys have probably seen it around the last couple of days or weeks. Since we can take manifestations for free now, the Krondspine has become much more popular than it was before and has had its time in the sun. And then it had been nerfed again a little bit, and now I'm actually a huge fan of it. I wasn't at first, but I've come around on it, and I really want to make a in-depth video about it for you guys today. So we're approaching this a little bit like we would for a unit breakdown. So we're gonna look at the Warscroll first, then we're gonna take a look at when do you actually bring the incarnate over other manifestation lores, for example. Then we'll look at some strategies, and this is really where the fun is, guys. So if you really know the Warscroll by heart already, and you kind of feel confident that you know when to pick the Krondspine, feel free to skip forward to the strategies and tips and tricks, because I also use those tips and tricks to round off all the things that I wanted to say. Usually I put some reiterations of things I've said before in there, but also some new stuff. So it's gonna be an interesting ride, guys. And please drop a like and a comment below and tell us about your Krondspine adventures. Alright, so Warscroll first, obviously. The Krondspine Incarnate of Ghur is a free spell. You take it as your entire manifestation lore. So in 4th edition, you get to bring one manifestation lore for all your wizards to use. Usually there are at least 3 spells in such a manifestation lore, but with the Krondspine it's just him. Now he is quite difficult to summon. I put it here, the image here on the right. So he has to be summoned on an 8+, which is quite difficult to cast. We'll see in just a little bit that it's actually only a 42 or 43% chance of summoning this successfully without bonuses. And if you put it on a battlefield, it has to be put into wholly within range of the caster and wholly within 12 inches of the caster, which is a short range for such a big base, and it has to be 9 inches from all enemy units. Now obviously this is interesting because just taking the Krondspine actually has to make you consider, is it worth it for my army specifically? We will get into this in the next segment where we're looking at when you need to pick the Krondspine. But obviously if you have an army that I know has 4 power levels or maybe even more than that, and you don't have a lot of good spells in your own spell lore, you're gonna be stuck with just one casting attempt on the Krondspine. And also, since it's only cast on an 8, you need bonuses or other ways to reliably get this on the battlefield. The Caligrave from Lumineth is a very good one for this one. I'm actually so in love with that combination that I might make a separate video on that altogether. But you know, there are plenty of other tricks that other armies have and other casting bonuses that you can get, and I will leave some suggestions for those kind of casting bonuses in the last section for the tips and tricks. All right, now let's look at the Warscroll itself. So you obviously can see that it doesn't have a lot of abilities, but that's a 4th edition thing, and it's kind of cool that way. It's neat and tidy. It moves 10 inches. It has 12 health, 4-up save, which is the best a manifestation can have. A 4-up save is the best save that there is for manifestations so far, at least. And it has a banishment of 8. So remember that I told you that casting it on an 8 is actually quite difficult. You can see here on the left that it only has a 42% chance of success, but that's the same for your opponent. So if you can get this off, and there are more casting bonuses than unbind or banishment bonuses in the game, if you can get this off, it's actually going to be very difficult for your opponent to try to banish this. And we will see in just a second there when we look at the abilities, that because it's so hard to banish, and it's also pretty hard to kill because it has 12 health and a 4-up save and a 6-up ward, people are going to want to leave this alone. They just want to ignore this and deal with the rest of your army, which is absolutely fine, because you only need that. Usually means that you only need 1 or 2 successful casting attempts throughout an entire game for this spell, and then it'll last you for, you know, the rest of the game. I tend to only summon this once or twice. and then it just does its thing. It heals by itself. We will look at that in a second as well. And it just, you know, causes havoc. I love it. Just a quick note here on the notes on the left. So you can see 42% chance of rolling an 8+, but when you bump it up to a 7+, by a power place of power, for example, that becomes a 48% chance, which is still not a lot, but you know, a massive difference. And that once again reiterates how important casting bonuses are, especially for the Krondspine. So if you're interested in those casting bonuses and the in-depth review of that, we actually just made a video about it last week, and it's called Places of Power. So go check that out, and I go in depth on all the chances you have for 2d6s and how important they are combined with the casting bonuses. Now I did hear from Ryan that while I didn't make mistakes, there is a different way of showing the improvement from a +1. So he will cover that in a specific separate video on the chances of rolling a 2d6 for his Math Hammer series. All right, so as we did with the other unit guides, we're going to look at the abilities separately and then also the stats separately. Now, for the Krondspine, I opted to start with the abilities because I do feel like the abilities kind of dictate how we can look at his stats. So first of all, we're going to look at the Devourer of Magics. So if this manifestation destroyed any enemy manifestations this turn, heal 6 to this manifestation. So two things to note here. If it killed or destroyed any manifestation, so if you even split your attacks and you kill 2 manifestations, you're not going to heal 12. So you're going to heal a 6 max, but that's still a massive heal, you guys. It's half his HP. And that's also the damage that he would take from Wild Form, which we'll get to in a second. Since we're in 4th edition, there's been a lot of manifestations around, of course. Everyone gets to pick one for free. Morbid Conjuration is super popular as of the time of making this video, which has 4 endless spells in it. So there are just plenty of ways to kill endless spells now. People love casting shackles, and you can actually cast the Krondspine into those shackles. Check the tips and tricks section for more on this. And thus healing is actually not that difficult. And since he's so difficult to kill or banish or you know, get rid of, putting 6 health back on his profile is actually really disheartening for your opponent as well. So keep that in mind. Healing 6 is very, very nice. Then we've got Wild Form is the same thing that you would see on the Gnashing Jaws and on the Purple Sun of Shaiish. So you can't actually banish this thing. So remember I said it's already pretty difficult for your opponent to roll an 8+ to banish it. Well, even if they roll an 8+, they're not getting rid of the Krondspine. They're just dealing 6 damage to it. Now, you can't you know, block that damage in any way. So even its 6-up ward cannot be used to block that damage. So he will just suffer 6-up straight damage. 6 straight damage. But that's still only half of his HP. Which means, guys, if you know, think about this a little bit, every manifestation can only be targeted once by the banishment ability. And a banishment ability can only be used by friendly wizards in your own turn. So for your Krondspine, only your opponent can use banishment in his turn. And you can also use it on your own Krondspine if you wanted to during your turn, obviously. But that means that if you cast it during your turn or in your opponent's turn, even with magical intervention, it's gonna last you at least 2 turns. Because it's gonna deal at best 6 damage with banishment. And then they'll either have to wait until the next turn to deal another 6 damage, or they're gonna have to work through the Krondspine with melee. And you know, if it's during your turn, you don't actually have to put it in melee if you don't want to. So if you want to use this guy as a screen, which is one of the strategies that we're gonna talk about in a little bit, you don't actually have to worry about your opponent just getting rid of it like you would have to consider it with, for example, the Gravetide is also a very nice manifestation to block movement with, but it can be banished, whereas the Krondspine is much more difficult to get rid of. But then my favorite ability personally is the Arcane Predator. So you can add 1 to the number of dice rolled when making charge rolls for this manifestation. to a maximum of 3. So usually you will actually just roll 3d6 charge, but sometimes your opponent has ways to reduce your charge rolls by 1. And I mean by 1 die in this case. While it is within 18 inches of any manifestations. Obviously you wouldn't use it outside of 18 inches because then you can't even get into combat with it. But if you do so, it must end that charge move within half an inch of an enemy manifestation. Now guys, don't let this fool you. It doesn't actually say that you have to attack it. You don't actually have to attack an enemy manifestation. You just have to end your charge move in range, but you could still pile in towards a different enemy. You can still target a different enemy. So definitely don't let yourself be restricted by this ability. Just use enemy manifestations as a sort of leap towards their other enemy units, right? Since there are so many manifestations around now, it's actually quite easy to get into range with them. On average, you're gonna get 10.5 inches out of a 3d6 roll, so either a 10 or an 11 on average. And then you're into the manifestation and you can just pile in 3 and get into their lines. And if you manage to get into a ranged unit, for example, you're tying that unit up for a full turn and a turn afterwards as well, unless you kill so many that they take them out of the front lines. So so many options for this, and the 3d6 charge thing is also something that we will talk about in the tips and tricks section a little bit more there. But let's first look at the attacks and the stats here. So we've already talked about the 12 health, the 10 move, the 4-up save with a 6+ ward, keep that in mind, and the 8+ banishments. But we actually haven't talked about is damage yet. Now the Krondspine used to be quite expensive back in 3rd edition, and thus it had to deal a lot of damage for its price point. Since it's become free now, the only price that you're paying for it is the fact that you don't have any other endless spells to cast. And so the damage has been lowered quite drastically, but it also had to do that. It would feel very, very wrong for it to be as strong as it was for free. Everyone would be trying to cast it now. Now you only get 6 attacks. It's a monster profile, so you see the typical hit and wound stats of a 4+ to hit and a 2+ to wound. Has a nice 2-up rend and then a 3 damage per attack. Now if you target an enemy manifestation, you actually get another pip of rend, and that's bumping you up to 3 rend here. On average, you can see the stats here, what that damage looks like. So versus a 4-up save, for example, the standard Krondspine would deal 6.25 damage. So it won't actually kill most small heroes, because most small heroes you are either already on a 3+, or you will make him move to a 3+ with all out defense. And dealing 5 damage is usually not enough for small heroes. I'm not looking at that really, really small goblin heroes and such who just flat out have 5 health, but then usually those have a worse save anyway. For manifestations, you actually don't have to look at the first 2 rows there. You don't look to the 2-up and 3-up save, because the best save a manifestation has is a 4-up save, so far at least. And thus the Krondspine, when he has 3 rend versus manifestations, will actually just simply deal something that would basically be mortal damage. It just goes straight through their armor save and onto their ward save. So on average, it will take out small manifestations. The small manifestations usually have around 6 wounds and 6-up wards, and that's usually just enough or just not enough, depending on what point of view you're taking here. But it's usually just enough for the Krondspine to take them out, and thus also heal 6, by the way. Keep that in mind. But against bigger manifestations or normal units, his damage isn't impressive. But that's not necessarily why you take him. Keep in mind that the damage here is more like the cherry on top, I feel like. Especially with his 4 to hits, this can really be very swingy. I played a couple of games with him so far, and if you roll 6 4-ups, you're gonna deal a ton of damage. But there's also plenty of cases where I only roll 2 or 1 4-up, and then it just feels like a waste of time anyway. So don't bank on his damage, but bank on all the other stuff that he can do for you. And that's something that we're going to talk about right now. So, oh, not right now. Of course, we first have to talk about when you bring him or when to pick him. You obviously have to decide when you're choosing your manifestation lores, am I actually getting enough value from bringing the Krondspine? Because you are losing out on all your other options, your army manifestations if you have them, but Morbid Conjuration is also super popular. You actually lose out on 4 endless spells that are quite easy to cast compared to the 1 endless spell that you get, and that is hard to cast. But there's also Primal Energy that is, in my eyes, pretty valuable. They've just buffed the what's it called, the swingy thing. So that's also a pretty good endless spell now. So when are you actually bringing the Krondspine? Well, if you'd ask me, it comes down to this. The Krondspine is actually really good if you have reliable casting bonuses. For example, my mind obviously goes to the Caligrave, but also to all the +1s that you get on your good wizards. Krondis, Nagash would actually have a lot of fun with the Krondspine, I think. Your Slans from Seraphon. There's so many ways you can get casting bonuses now. The Places of Power, check out our video on that. So once you get the reliable casting bonus to at least get this off a couple of times during a game, then I would seriously consider bringing the Krondspine. And as I mentioned before, once you get him out, it's going to last you either the entire game or at least half a game, unless they put a lot of resources into it. But then it kind of has done its job if they had to put a lot of resources into it. So yeah, you'll see they're either going to ignore it or going to sink a lot of resources in it, and then you've won either way. It's also pretty good if you don't have a lot of power levels. Now, what do I mean by that? I kind of mentioned it beforehand as well. I've played a lot of Lumineth lists with 4 power levels, and then if you're only bringing the Krondspine and on top of the 3 spells you get from your normal spell lore, you're sometimes wondering, like, what else am I gonna cast? Of course, you have one of your unlimited spells. In the Lumineth example, it's Speed of Fish, which is a great spell. But there are times where I'm thinking, I'm kind of I don't really feel like I have anything else to cast that is still useful. And then you're wishing that you maybe brought a manifestation lore that gave you more options. But then I've swapped to a list where I've only had 2 power levels, and that's actually a really, really nice sweet spot for the Krondspine, I feel. The first turn you spend half your power levels on summoning him and maybe popping 1 important spell. Keep in mind you have magical intervention as well. And then afterwards, they leave your Krondspine alone, and then you just can use those 2 power levels to do all your other stuff. So I feel like power level 2 is a sweet spot. 3 and 4, you might have to consider all other manifestation lores. And if you only have power level 1, it can be kind of rough if you don't have enough casting bonuses or it isn't reliably cast, because then you're always wasting your 1 casting attempt on the Krondspine. So if you only have 1 wizard with just a 1 power level, I would probably not opt to bring the Krondspine. Still worth it though. It's in certain lists, if you don't really mind having your 1 spell attempt being used for the Krondspine every time, it'll still be fine. I also feel like it has massive value for castle builds. As a castle player myself, because just my armies are quite fragile. I play a lot of elves. They tend to castle from turn 1 on. I've noticed that armies have become much more expensive, and not all armies actually have the points or units to use as screens. Not all armies have furies or skinks or other cheap frontline defenders. And then the Krondspine is actually a really nice tool to replace that gap in your army, literally, because we will look at that in a graph in our strategy section. But if you have your front lines, and your frontline units are the units that are valuable to you and aren't actually screens you can just throw away, popping a massive base from the Krondspine just right in front of them is actually really impactful. So definitely consider bringing the Krondspine if you're playing a castle build. And then one tip that I can give you, if you have a way that you can put a wizard close to the center to pop the Krondspine onto the center, that is a very, very good reason to bring the Krondspine. But then you also have to consider all the other topics that or all the other bullet points that I had here above that. But let's look at a graph on what I mean by if you put a wizard close to the center. So we're going to look at some strategies, and the first one that we're going to look at is the one that is called controlling the center. So in our example here, I have a front line of a lot of 32 mil bases and one 32 mil wizards in the light golden color here. Now we place our front lines, or at least our wizards, 9 inches from the center of the battlefield. So as far up as we are allowed to do. You could put him right in front of the center or a little bit off center, as I did here in my example, just because I don't really feel comfortable landing my wizard right in front of the center usually. I try to keep him close to terrain or close to a forest or something like that. But keep it somewhere on the front line. Then you cast your Krondspine onto the middle. Keep in mind you need to summon your Krondspine wholly within 12 inches, so that's why we put our wizard as much in front as we did here. And the Krondspine has actually such a big base that it can almost cover the entire middle of the battlefield, so the center of the battlefield. And if you remember, guys, what's one of the most popular battle tactics for turn 1? Seize the center, right? Now, if you remember, seize the center says that you have to have 2 units within 3 inches of the center of the battlefield, but they cannot be in combat. Well, you guys, if you manage to place a Krondspine even, a tenth of an inch on the middle point of the battlefield, there is no way that your opponent can approach a Krondspine and still be out of combat, right? Because combat range is 3 inches. So that actually destroys your opponent's battle tactic from the get-go. So if you manage to give your opponent first turn, for example, and he baits himself into going with seize the center, and you manage to pop off the Krondspine with magical intervention, keep in mind that would basically mean that you're casting it on a 9, which is very unlikely to go off. But if it does, or you have a way to make it easier to pop off, you can actually place that Krondspine before they start their movement. And once it's on the center of the battlefield, they have no way to deal with that. The only way that they can get rid of the Krondspine and still, achieve their battle tactic is by shooting it and fighting it, which is both risky and great for you, because if they want to sink all those resources, all those shooting attacks, all those melee attacks into dealing with the Krondspine, that means that your actual units that you paid for, are not getting targeted by those attacks. So that's worth it in and of itself as well. So either you're forcing your opponent to waste resources, or you're completely ruining his battle tactic, which is both very nice. Now, even outside of that battle tactic story here, just having such a big threat and big monster on the middle of the field is actually just very, very strong. So even if he doesn't go for seize the center, I feel like having the Krondspine there is still pretty nasty. Now keep in mind, guys, this is something that I will also mention in the tips and tricks section, but a lot of people love shackles right now from the Morbid Conjuration, and they usually tend to throw them up in the middle because you want to do something with your first turn. Now, you can actually cast a Krondspine into the shackles, because the shackles doesn't have a movement value and thus doesn't count for being 9 inches away from enemy units. So you can actually cast a Krondspine right into combat with the shackles with either magical intervention or during your turn. So that's pretty neat. Also having the Krondspine there and then using his 3d6 charge to get into your opponent's manifestations from turn 1 even is a very nice way of tying up their ranged units or something like that. You can also use it as a screen, as I mentioned. So in this example, This is also obviously a perfect example, but there are many ways that this still works. So I have two buildings here, two terrain pieces in light gray. The right terrain piece is a Seraphon temple, but that might actually be one of your faction terrain piece or something different. And the one on the left here is just a normal terrain piece from the setup. The red is obviously your enemy units, and the brown and gold are your units. Now, just imagine your opponent plans on charging your units. You can feel this coming. They can obviously charge your terrain feature and then pile into your unit as well. It makes it actually even easier for them to get into combat, so it doesn't look good for you. Now, your opponent might still be 9 inches away from you. That's probably the case, or even a little bit more than that. And then you can summon the Krondspine right in the middle there, right in the middle of those terrain pieces. And this does a couple of things for you. First of all, it would force your opponent to stay 3 inches away from the Krondspine, and thus making the charge distance even longer. But in our example here with the terrain pieces, this actually blocks your opponent's charge completely, because opponents can move through endless spells, but they cannot move on endless spells. Your opponent would actually have to roll a massive charge here to get his entire unit, all of his models, through the Krondspine and not end on the Krondspine's base, especially with how the terrain pieces are set up here. So definitely keep that in mind when you're using this trick, and if your opponent rolls a high charge roll, before he moves his own units, make him measure every model and check whether every model from the back line, and check whether he would be able to place those models and while they're not on the Krondspine's base, not even a little bit. Because in this example, that would actually be quite difficult, for example. Obviously, you can do this with a lot of endless spells, you guys, but the Krondspine is, once again, very difficult to banish and very difficult to deal with as well. It's a little bit like the Purple Sun, but it has a bigger base. Sometimes that's worse for you. Sometimes you want a smaller base because it's difficult to have that base 9 inches from enemy units. But in other times, like in this example, this is actually a huge boon. Now, do keep in mind, guys, that you might actually make it difficult for yourself as well. If your opponent just leaves his red unit over there and you have a hard time moving your Krondspine over those terrain pieces and outside of combat still, you can move your own units through that. So that is also something that you have to keep in mind when you're summoning it. So it does take a little bit of finesse to pilot this endless spell to its full ability or capabilities, but once you get the hang of it, it is very rewarding. All right, let's take a look at some tips and tricks. I've got 3 for you here. First of all, some tips on how to plan for the Krondspine, then some tips on the 3d6 charge, and then some tips on casting into manifestations. So first of all, when you're using the Krondspine, you have to consider its uses when you're list building. I wouldn't bring the Krondspine when you have useless wizards or wizards with low power levels, for example, unless you really don't care about your own spell lores. If you're like, okay, I have an army full of pigs, for example, and I have one small shaman on the left and he doesn't really interact with my army at all because they're going to be out of range anyway, sure, why not bring a Krondspine? It might actually do you more good than the Morbid Conjuration spells, for example. But keep in mind that if you have bad wizards, so no pluses ones or anything like that, or not a lot of power levels, you might spend a lot of time and value into trying to get that Krondspine summoned, and it doesn't actually work as often as you would think. You might actually go an entire game without it. So that is risky. And also when you're deploying here, a good deployment is key here. It's obviously always important to deploy well, but with the Krondspine especially, you have to think about a couple of things. First of all, he needs to be summoned on an 8+, so that's only a 42% chance. If you want to bump it up to a 58% chance by summoning him on a 7+, you probably want your wizard to be close to a place of power. Now, we talk about this in the place of power video, but a lot of missions or battle plans have places of power, but a lot of them also have them on the sides, which means your Krondspine can't be summoned into middle when you want your wizard to benefit from the place of power. So that's something that you have to consider. You have to weigh in, like, do I care more about the off chance of getting it onto the middle, or do I just want to get it off and then use it to cover a flank for me or something like that? There are also a lot of magical intervention options because it has such a big base and it has to be wholly within 12 and wholly outside of 9. There aren't as many places that you can set it down during your game, as in if you're in turn 3, for example, and there are enemy units everywhere, and your units have been split up. It is so difficult to still summon a Krondspine because usually one of your wizards is close to your units, and maybe your units are in combat, and then it's difficult with such a big base to get it right for positioning. So I really like it a lot for magical intervention. But then if you have no casting bonuses, you get that -1 to your spell casting, which basically means you have to cast a Krondspine on a 9. And that's even harder, right? So if you play Lumineth, bring your Caligrave for that. And as I mentioned, the Krondspine placement itself is also super, super important. If you place your wizard too far back, keep in mind you can't actually move before you have to summon a Krondspine usually. So measure the distance from your wizards and your other units and make sure you can actually place a Krondspine before you tell your opponent, okay, I'm good, I've deployed my wizard here. So that is something that you have to keep in mind of, because the base is very, very large. All right, then the 3-6 charge. I mean, for our pro players that are listening to this, they will probably think like, Jonas, this is so obvious. But I just once again want to reiterate how important it is to keep in mind that this actually is a huge deal. Your charge goes from an average of 7 to an average of 10 or 11, which is a very long distance, something that most opponents aren't counting on either, because we are so used of staying outside of a range. Like if you leave your units 9 or 10 inches away from an enemy unit, a 9 or 10 inch charge is unlikely to happen, right? But a 10 or 11 inch charge on average is scary in that regard. So your opponent kind of tends to miss out on how far the Krondspine can go. But obviously you need to end up your charge within half an inch of a manifestation, but you don't have to target your enemy manifestations. So please do feel free to pile in towards other units, target small heroes, tie up a unit or something like that. Even if they end up killing your Krondspine, it's actually not that likely, because people usually tend to deploy their units in lines and then summon their manifestations to the side of those lines or right in front of those lines. So you attack your enemy manifestation, you pile in towards the left or the right of the units, and then even if they do 3-inch piling themselves with their 3-inch combat range, they might not actually get all their attacks in either. So chance of your Krondspine surviving actually pretty big in most situations. And then the last one, this one I've also mentioned, you can actually cast the Krondspine into enemy manifestations as long as they don't have a movement value. So you do have to set up 9 inches or further from enemy units as long as they have a movement value. But keep in mind that endless spells or manifestations only count as enemy units in the movement phase or in the hero phase as well, if they have a movement value, sort of. So you could actually set up this manifestation. So the Krondspine, you can summon them already into combat range with shackles, which means you get to fight from turn onwards, which is a nice tool, because my opponent usually tend to summon the shackles right in front of my lines just to kind of annoy me a little bit. And I'm like, sure, that's fine. I'll use my Caligrave and Magical Intervention. I'll drop the Krondspine behind your shackles or in front if they've left me enough space. And I get to fight them from turn 1. And as we saw in our previous section here, on average, it's going to kill the shackles, because it'll have 3 rends, 3 flat damage, or 6 and a little bit more than 6 goes through 7.5, I think. So even with the ward save from the shackles, you usually end up killing those shackles and thus freeing up your own units to move once again. So interesting to keep in mind there, that you can actually do that as well. Et voilà, as the French would say. This brings us to the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It's actually the first time that I've made a video about endless spells. That's usually Reins's domain, I guess. But I've just been in love with the Krondspine and all of its shenanigans. Now I do understand that I'm talking from a point of, you know, an advantageous point here because I play in Lumineth and I have the Caligrave, which is, you know, BFFs with the Krondspine. But just go to your go to the app or to your index, look at all the wizard options that you have, and just check what wizards have casting bonuses or what wizards have ways to get off these manifestations in a more guaranteed way, you know. And if you have a lot of trouble dealing with the incarnates, you are now more prepared than ever to deal with it because you know how your opponent will probably try to use it, and thus now you can kind of work around that. But guys, if you love this video as much as I love making it, or even maybe a little bit more, please leave a like. Please share it around if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to stay in touch. Leaving comments and leaving likes is the best way for us to feel, well, one, your gratitude and you know, your appreciation. But two, it gets us picked up by the algorithm that generates some value for us, some income for us, and that allows me and Ryan to at least feel a little bit more rewarded on top of all the rewards that we reap from just your positive feedback. But also leave your Krondspine adventures or things like that in the comments, or if you've got any questions, you can talk to us in either comments or the Discord. The link for that is in the description. We'll see you guys in the next one. The next couple of videos are probably army reviews, guys. What armies do you think we'll be reviewing? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next one, guys. Bye-bye.